The knock was so loud I thought the door might break. "Open up, Mr. Harper," a voice yelled. "Your wife is under arrest." I froze, holding my coffee, staring at the door. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. I peeked through the window. 4 men stood on my porch, all wearing cheap HOA inspector shirts. But one of them, Greg Mason, my neighbor, was holding a gun. I stepped back. "What's this about?" I asked, my voice shaky. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Sarah, my wife, walked up calm as ever. She barely glanced at the men. "Stay here," she said, her voice sharp. "I'll handle this." And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just some HOA violation. When Sarah and I moved to Cypress Ridge, we thought we'd finally found the peace we'd been craving. After years of living in the chaos of San Diego, endless traffic sirens, and the constant buzz of city life, we were ready for something quieter. A place where you could hear the birds, where neighbors waved as you passed, and where a weekend BBQ was the highlight of the week. We bought a 2-story house at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by trees and well-kept lawns. It felt like a second honeymoon. We were both in our mid-42s, and after working ourselves to the bone for over a decade, the change was refreshing. I had a steady job as a civil engineer overseeing construction projects. Sarah, well, she told everyone she was a private security consultant, a vague enough job to satisfy curiosity, but mysterious enough to keep people from asking too many questions. The truth, though, was more complicated. Sarah had spent over a decade as a law enforcement officer, working her way up through the sheriff's office. She'd been elected sheriff of the county the year before we moved. I knew she was good at her job. Her calm demeanor in stressful situations spoke volumes, but I didn't know just how skilled she was or how high up she had risen. She kept her career a secret from most people, even from me, for a while. It was safer that way, she explained. Some of her enemies were real, and some of them had resources to make her life complicated. So we came here to this quiet place to escape. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's past had a way of following her, even in a peaceful neighborhood. The first few weeks in Cypress Ridge were perfect. We settled into new routines, walking the loop around the block in the evenings, watching the sunset from our porch. The neighborhood felt safe, almost idyllic. And then we met Greg Mason. He lived across the street, tall, fit, mid-32s with a clean-cut look and a smile that always seemed a little too practiced. At first, he was the perfect neighbor, helping me with minor repairs, complimenting Sarah's garden, inviting us to a barbecue. He told us he was both a local cop and the neighborhood safety chair for the HOA. A role I didn't even know existed. He seemed friendly enough, but something about him felt off. Still, I figured it was no big deal. We were just settling in after all. For a while, everything seemed perfect. Greg even kept his police cruiser parked out front like a badge of honor, and his safety chair role gave the block a false sense of security. Neighbors spoke of how lucky we were to have someone with law enforcement experience living among us. I thought we had found a place where everyone knew each other, where life moved slower and people were kind. That easy peace started to shift when we decided to replace our old wooden fence. It was falling apart, splintering in places, and honestly, it was an eyesore. We wanted something sturdier, something that would give Sarah more privacy for her work. We checked the city ordinances, got a property survey, pulled the necessary permits, and hired a contractor. The new fence was legal within city code. We were well within our rights. But once the work started, Greg's attitude changed. The friendly waves stopped. The casual conversations evaporated. He started appearing in his front yard more often, arms crossed, glaring at the crew. His wife Linda began avoiding us on her dog walks, passing by without a word. Then one evening, Greg knocked on our door. He was wearing a dark polo with a patch on his chest, not quite a police uniform, but enough to make him look official. He called me Mike for some reason, even though that wasn't my name. "Hey Mike," he said, "would you consider lowering that fence to 4 feet? It's blocking my view of the street from my kitchen window." I was taken aback. "The fence is within city regulations, Greg. We got all the permits. I don't think we can change it." Greg's smile didn't waver, but his tone shifted. "As a representative of the HOA, I think we should prioritize community harmony over individual preferences." That was the first time I heard him mention the HOA like it had real power. I closed the door after he left, still trying to convince myself it was nothing, just a neighbor with a strong opinion. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to end with just a fence. It didn't take long for the cracks in the neighborhood's peaceful facade to show. Greg's behavior began to shift the moment we started building the fence. I'd seen him lurking around more frequently, arms crossed watching us work, his eyes constantly darting towards Sarah's backyard like he was monitoring something more than just construction. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe he was just one of those overprotective neighbors. But as the days passed, something felt off. The first real sign that things were escalating came in the form of an envelope in our mailbox. I tore it open, thinking it was a typical HOA newsletter or an invitation to another one of Greg's community safety events. Instead, it was a formal notice from the Oakwood Heights Homeowners Association. Violation of community aesthetic standards, it said, referencing the new fence. It wasn't even a complaint, it was a formal warning accompanied by the threat of a $500 per day fine if we didn't comply. My stomach sank as I read the words again. There was no legal justification for this. We had all the permits, and our fence was well within the city code. This was nothing but a petty attack, an attempt to bend us to his will. Sarah was in the backyard when I showed it to her. She paused mid-workout, wiping sweat from her forehead as she glanced over the letter. "They can't do this," she said, her tone flat and unwavering. "I called the number on the letter," I said. "The receptionist said they have no record of this notice being sent." A muscle in Sarah's jaw tightened, but she didn't say anything. She simply nodded as if she already knew that this was Greg's handiwork. It wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was personal, and we both knew it. A week later, things took a sharper turn. Greg started spreading rumors about us, about Sarah specifically. He began hinting to neighbors that Sarah's job in private security was actually something far more sinister. He even went so far as to suggest that we were involved in some kind of national security threat, which was not only untrue but absurd. His words weren't direct, but they carried enough weight to make people nervous. Sarah and I could feel the tension growing in the neighborhood, the subtle shift in how people interacted with us. A few neighbors started crossing the street to avoid us, others wouldn't make eye contact. It was as though Greg was planting seeds of doubt, turning people against us. That's when the notes started. The first one showed up under our windshield wiper, polite but passive-aggressive. "We'd appreciate it if you'd work with the community for everyone's benefit." At first, I thought it was just another attempt to get us to comply with the HOA's aesthetic standards. But after the third note, each one more pointed than the last, I realized that these weren't just from Greg. Someone else was involved. The handwriting changed with each note as though Greg had enlisted other neighbors to do his dirty work. But why Sarah started spending more time in the backyard phone, pressed to her ear in low-measured conversations I couldn't overhear. She had always been private, but something about her tone, calm, deliberate, made me uneasy. She wasn't the kind of person to get rattled by petty HOA politics, so I knew this was something bigger. But I still didn't know how deep it went. Greg's behavior became more erratic. He began showing up at odd times, lurking in his driveway, watching us through his windows. And then one Saturday afternoon, he organized what he called an emergency HOA meeting in the middle of the street, right in front of our house. Around 20 neighbors showed up, their faces, a mix of confusion and concern. I saw Mrs. Patterson, the sweet old lady who'd once brought us cookies, standing off to the side, avoiding eye contact. Greg had set up a sign that read "Neighborhood Safety Chair" on a folding chair, and he was holding court lecturing everyone on the dangers of our fence. "This isn't just about aesthetics," Greg said, loudly pointing to the new fence like it was a crime scene. A fence this high could hide suspicious activities from street view. He made sure to glance at our windows as if he were accusing us of something. I stood in the doorway with Sarah, both of us watching as the tension built. Greg's voice had an edge to it that I hadn't heard before, and his audience seemed captivated. A few people nodded, unsure of what to think. Others looked uncomfortable. Then Greg dropped the bombshell. "I've conducted a background investigation on our new neighbors," he said, glancing at Sarah, his voice tinged with accusation. "Sarah Harper works at a classified facility, and her exact job description is marked confidential. For all we know, we could be living next to people who pose a threat to national security." There it was. The seed he'd planted was now in full bloom. The whispers of national security, threats of espionage. My jaw clenched and I felt Sarah's posture stiffen beside me. This wasn't just about the fence anymore. Greg was digging into our personal lives, trying to paint Sarah as a danger to the community. I glanced at Sarah. She was still calm, but I could see the shift in her eyes. I knew she'd had enough. "I think it's time we call the sheriff," she said quietly. Greg's face twisted into something between a sneer and a scowl. "You're making a big mistake." "No," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "The mistake is yours." Before Greg could respond, Sarah turned and walked inside, her expression unreadable. I followed her into the living room where she picked up her phone. "I'm calling the sheriff's office," she said. And in that moment, I realized this was no longer a battle over a fence. This was something much bigger, and we were about to expose Greg for who he really was. It felt like time slowed as Sarah and I stood in the living room. I could still hear Greg's voice outside, loud, and filled with that same smug certainty that had started to make my skin crawl. "This isn't over," he had muttered, his words laced with threat. Sarah's fingers hovered over the phone before she dialed. "Sheriff's office," she said, her voice calm. "I need to speak with the duty sergeant. It's an emergency." I didn't need to ask who she was calling. A few seconds later she hung up. "Help's on the way," she said, her eyes focused on the door. Moments later the first knock came, a loud, deliberate rap that rattled the frame. I could feel my pulse quicken. This was no longer about offense. Greg had pushed too far. When Sarah opened the door, I saw them 4 men in tactical gear standing in a tight formation. 2 of them, including Greg, had handguns strapped to their sides. They looked more like a SWAT team than HOA inspectors, and I felt my stomach churn as I saw the tension in their posture. Greg stepped forward, trying to take control. "We've had reports of unusual activity on your property," he barked. "HOA protocol says we inspect immediately when there's a security issue. We need to speak to you now." Sarah didn't flinch. Her eyes were cold, but there was no hesitation in her voice when she replied. "Show me your paperwork," she said firmly. Greg faltered, momentarily caught off guard. What his confidence cracked. "I'm a law enforcement officer. This is my jurisdiction." Sarah didn't budge. She stepped forward slightly, just enough for Greg to see the silver sheriff's badge pinned to her jacket. Greg's face went pale. For the first time I saw doubt in his eyes. He glanced at his men, unsure of what to do next. "Your jurisdiction," Sarah asked, her voice low but sharp. "You're on my property at 2:00 a.m., armed and without a warrant. That's illegal." Greg's hand twitched toward his gun. I tensed, but Sarah stood her ground, calm and steady. "If you cross that threshold, you'll be trespassing," she continued, "and you'll be leaving here in the back of a real police cruiser." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. I thought Greg might do something reckless, but then one of the men behind him whispered something in his ear. Greg's face flushed red, his jaw tightening in frustration. "This isn't over," Greg growled, but his voice had lost its edge. Sarah didn't flinch. She locked eyes with him and said, "No, Greg, the mistake is yours, and you're running out of time." With a final defeated look, Greg backed away, signaling for the others to leave. They melted into the darkness, their boots crunching on the gravel as they retreated down the street. Sarah remained standing in the doorway, her eyes scanning the street. I could feel the tension in the air, but it was clear we had won this round. The neighborhood felt quiet again, but the kind of quiet that was heavy, almost suffocating. The streetlights hummed back on, casting long shadows across the now silent block. I stood by the door, my heart still racing from what had just happened. Sarah was still, her eyes scanning the street, waiting. "Who exactly are you?" I asked, the words finally spilling out after everything I had just witnessed. Sarah didn't respond right away. She turned to the stove and set the kettle on, watching it hiss to life. "Not yet," she said, her voice calm but heavy with meaning. But I knew that answer was coming. And when it came, nothing about our quiet suburban life would look the same. She turned to face me, her eyes steady. "My name is Sarah Harper. I'm the elected sheriff of this county." I froze, the words not quite landing. "Sheriff," I repeated as though I hadn't heard her correctly. She nodded slowly. 15 years in law enforcement. 10 of those as sheriff. I didn't tell you because I wanted us to have a normal life here. But after tonight, normal is gone. The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. I had no idea. All this time I thought I knew Sarah. But now everything had changed. "You've been a sheriff all this time?" I asked, still trying to wrap my mind around it. "That's right," she replied softly. "When you hold that position, you make enemies, people with real power and real resources. It's safer for both of us if they don't know where I live." I felt the weight of her words settle into my chest. "So Greg. He wasn't just some nosy neighbor." "No," she replied, her tone firm. "He's part of something bigger. Greg's working for Victor Hale, a man who runs a real estate scam targeting military families. He pressures people to sell their homes at below-market prices, flips them for a huge profit. Greg's role was to intimidate people to make their lives miserable until they had no choice but to sell." My mind reeled. I hadn't realized how far this had gone. It wasn't just about a fence or a petty HOA dispute. Greg had been manipulating the whole neighborhood for a criminal enterprise. "And he targeted us?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. Sarah's face hardened. "Yes, he thought he could push us around like he's done to others, but he made a mistake. He picked the wrong people to mess with." I could feel the tension from the past few days melting away, replaced by a sense of purpose. It was clear now this wasn't just about standing up for ourselves. It was about exposing Greg and his whole operation. "So what happens now?" I asked, finally grasping the full scope of what we were facing. Sarah moved to the table, pulling up documents on her laptop. "Now we gather the evidence. We make sure Greg can't hurt anyone else. This isn't over." She worked quickly, pulling up the records and connecting the dots. Greg wasn't even a registered police officer. His whole identity was a lie. He's been lying to everyone, Sarah said, her voice flat. And he's been working for Hale for years. But now we have the proof. A few days later, the authorities moved in. They arrested Greg, dismantling his whole operation. His fraudulent HOA inspections, his manipulation of the neighborhood, and his ties to Hale were all exposed. The truth came out, and the neighborhood began to change. People who had been avoiding us started coming forward apologizing, even thanking Sarah. The HOA was restructured with new leadership focused on transparency and fairness. The grip Greg had on the community was finally broken. I watched Sarah at the HOA meeting a few weeks later, standing in front of the crowd, calm and confident. "This isn't just about a fence," she said. "It's about protecting your community. If you see something wrong, you speak up. That's how you keep a neighborhood safe." The applause was hesitant at first, but it grew as the crowd began to realize just how much she had done for them. As we sat on the porch later that evening, I turned to Sarah, still processing everything. "Is it really over?" I asked. She looked out at the street, the faintest glint in her eyes. "It's over for Greg. But it's not over for everyone. There are still people like him out there." I thought about what she had said, the postcard we had received, the warning that there were more. But Sarah wasn't scared. If anything, she seemed prepared for whatever came next. The neighborhood had changed. Greg's lies had been exposed, and now the HOA worked for the people, not against them. "Something's coming," she murmured, standing up from the porch. "But we'll be ready for it." And with Sarah by my side, I knew we would be.